She had driven 90 minutes from Portland to ask a single question, and she almost turned around twice before she got there. The man she was looking for wasn't hard to find. He was on the roof of the old carriage house at the edge of the property, replacing cedar shingles in the November cold, working from the ridge down, with the methodical patience of someone who had done this before and expected to be doing it for a while. He didn't look up when her car stopped on the gravel. He kept working. She got out. The air smelled like pine resin and wood smoke. Her firm's senior partner had said, before she left the office, that she was overthinking it, that it was a straightforward acquisition, that the historical designation issue had already been assessed by their legal team and found to be manageable. She had nodded. She had not told him she was driving to Harwick herself. She looked up at the man on the roof. "Are you Lyndon?" she called. He set a shingle down, checked its alignment, then looked at her. He had the kind of face that didn't perform surprise. He climbed down with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had decided not to rush before he started. "My mother's attorney said you'd been asking about this property," he said. "My firm is handling the acquisition of the Aldrin block. Your mother's estate includes the carriage house and the eastern parcel, which overlaps with the designated footprint." She paused. "I wanted to speak with you directly." He looked at her for a moment, then turned back toward the carriage house door. "There's coffee inside. You can have some while I wash my hands." She followed him in because there was nothing else to do. Lyndon Voss had come to Harwick 14 months ago with his son and a borrowed utility trailer, and very little else he needed to carry. His mother had been declining since the previous spring, the kind of slow decline that required someone nearby and patient, and he had been the only one available. His sister was in Phoenix with 4 children and a husband who traveled. His brother hadn't spoken to their mother since 2017, for reasons Lyndon understood even if he didn't share them. He had taken a leave from the architecture firm, where he'd spent 11 years. He had told them he'd be back in 6 months. 6 months became 8, 8 became 14, and somewhere in the 9th month his mother had looked at him over the kitchen table and said, without preamble, "You're not going back." He hadn't argued. He wasn't sure she was wrong. Harwick was a town of 4,000 people in the hills of western Maine, the kind of place where the gas station doubled as a deli, and everyone knew who'd had a hard winter by how many firewood deliveries they'd received. He had lived there until he was 18 and left, without looking back, and returned at 41 to find that the town had the same proportions he remembered, just slower. His son, Theo, was 10. He had his mother's eyes and Lyndon's tendency toward silence, which, in combination, made him a child who observed more than he spoke and was generally underestimated by adults who hadn't learned that yet. Theo's mother had left when Theo was 6, not in the sudden violent way that breaks things clean, but in the gradual way that leaves a shape behind, the way a body leaves an impression in a mattress. She had wanted something Lyndon had not been able to see clearly enough to give her. She had tried to explain it more than once, and he had listened, but understanding a thing clearly and being able to change it were not the same. She was in Seattle now, remarried, consistent with her monthly calls to Theo. They had arrived at a workable arrangement without hostility. Lyndon thought about her sometimes the way you think about weather that has passed. It was real, it mattered, and it is not what is happening now. He had fixed his mother's house through the winter. The carriage house came next. The roof had been leaking in 2 places, and the sill plate, on the north side, had rotted through in a section, and the drainage around the foundation had been directing water toward the structure for at least 15 years. He worked on it in the mornings before Theo left for school, and on weekend afternoons when Theo was at the neighbor's with the boy his age who collected vintage road maps and didn't find that odd. He hadn't hired anyone. There was something clarifying about the work, about the precision it required, about the way a correctly placed shingle stayed where you put it. Her name was Nadia Carr. She was 38, a partner at Corvin and Marsh in Portland, which handled commercial real estate acquisitions for institutional clients, and she was good at her job in the specific way that meant she didn't leave things to assumption. She verified. She read the original documents rather than the summaries. She called the people that other lawyers sent letters to. She had been handling the Aldrin block acquisition for 5 months. The block was 11 acres in downtown Harwick, the site of the old textile mill and its surrounding structures, which a Boston-based development group called Terrafirm wanted to convert into a mixed-use residential and retail complex. It was the kind of project that worked on paper and had worked in 3 similar markets. Harwick needed housing. The mill had been vacant for 8 years. The carriage house was the problem. It sat at the eastern edge of the Aldrin block, technically adjacent to but legally distinct from the mill property, and it had been included in a state historical designation in 2018 that Terrafirm's initial assessment had flagged as dormant pending review. Nadia had read that phrase twice and found it insufficient. Historical designations in Maine did not go dormant. They were either active or they had been formally rescinded, and the rescission process required a public hearing. She had found no record of a public hearing. She had asked Terrafirm's project lead, a man named Pierce Alt, about it directly. He had said the legal team had it handled. She had asked what handled meant. He had said the designation was a formality, and the state office had informally agreed to advance the rescission under the development incentive provision. Informally agreed, she had repeated. Nadia, he had said, with the patient condescension of someone who had been closing deals for 20 years. This is how these things work. She had driven to Harwick the next morning. The coffee was black and strong, and Lyndon offered it without asking how she took it, which turned out to be exactly how she took it. The interior of the carriage house was half finished, the south wall stripped to the studs, the new framing visible. Everything measured with the exactness of someone who had done it professionally and was doing it now as something else, something more considered. She looked at the walls while he washed his hands at a utility sink. "You're an architect," she said. "I was." He dried his hands. "I did restoration work mostly. Old structures, historic preservation, sometimes." He poured his own coffee and leaned against the workbench. "What's your firm's position on the designation?" She was mildly surprised that he already understood what was at stake. She told him. She told him what Terrafirm had said, what Pierce Alt had said, what the phrase informally agreed had sounded like when she'd heard it. She was accustomed to giving people the executive summary and then the details if they asked. She found herself giving him both simultaneously without planning to. He listened with the quality of attention that is different from just waiting to speak. When she finished, he nodded once. "The rescission requires a public hearing and a 60-day comment period," he said. "It also requires written consent from the original nominating party. In 2018, the nominating party was the Harwick Historical Commission. You'd need a commission vote to release it." She looked at him. "That's not in the state summary document." "No," he said. "It's in the enabling legislation. 2011 amendment." He turned and pulled a manila folder from a shelf above the workbench, the kind of shelf that held, in most workshops, sandpaper and spare hardware. This one held, apparently, reference documents organized in a manner that suggested frequent use. He set the folder on the bench and opened it to a page with a section highlighted in pencil. 3rd paragraph. She read it. He was right, completely right, in a way that made Terrafirm's informally agreed formulation actively problematic. "You've read the enabling legislation," she said. "My mother was on the Historical Commission in 2018, he said. She was one of the signatories on the original nomination." She looked at the folder, then at him. "How long have you known about the acquisition proposal?" 3 months. He said it the way a person says something that answers one question and opens 3 more, without any apparent intention of opening them himself. She drove back to Portland that afternoon and found Pierce Alt already in her inbox, asking about her timeline for resolving the designation issue. She read the email twice and did not respond immediately. Instead, she pulled the 2011 amendment herself, the original statute, the commission meeting minutes from 2018, and the correspondence files from the State Historical Office that she had not yet requested and should have. What she found in the correspondence file was not a formal agreement. It was an email exchange between someone on Terrafirm's development team and a low-level administrative coordinator at the state office. The coordinator had said, in the imprecise language of someone who had been asked something they weren't authorized to answer, that the review process could potentially be expedited under certain economic development provisions. This was not an informal agreement. It was a question that had been answered ambiguously and then reported upward, through 2 layers of Terrafirm's organization, as a green light. She called her partner Gwen from the parking structure. "Tell me about Pierce Alt," she said. Gwen was quiet for half a breath. "What kind of tell me?" "The kind where you tell me what everyone knows that nobody says." Another pause, shorter. "He's closed 40 million in deals in 2 years, Nadia. The firm is not going to be thrilled if you slow this down." "I'm not slowing it down," she said. "I'm finding out where the ground is before we build on it." She sat in the parking structure for a while after she hung up. Then she drove home. She came back to Harwick on a Thursday. She told herself it was to verify the commission records in person, which was true. The town clerk's office kept paper archives going back to the 1970s, and the 2018 commission minutes had not been digitized. She needed to see them. She had read them completely in 40 minutes. She had then spent another 20 minutes in the clerk's office, because the clerk, a woman named Agnes, who had been there for 31 years, had a way of describing town history as though it were weather, something that moved through and left evidence. And Nadia found herself asking about the mill, and the textile families, and the people who had left and come back, and the ones who hadn't come back. Afterward, she walked past the carriage house on her way to her car, because it was on the way, which was almost entirely true. Theo was in the front yard with a stick he was using to measure something along the fence line. He was precise about it, heel to toe with the stick, marking intervals with small stones. He looked up when she stopped at the gate. "You were here last week," he said. It was not an accusation. "I was," she said. He looked at her assessingly, with the patience of a child who had learned not to rush his conclusions. "He's in the back," he said. Then he returned to his measuring. She went around the side of the house. Lyndon was in the kitchen garden, which had been put to bed for winter, but which he was clearly already planning forward. There were stakes with tags in the ground, the kind you use to mark where you've planted bulbs or where you intend to. Some of the tags had writing on them she couldn't read from the gate. "Commission minutes confirm what you said," she told him. "The nomination required a full vote, and all 3 original signatories are still living." He had his back to her, crouching to press a stake more firmly into the soil. He stood up. "My mother won't vote to release it." "I know. The other 2 won't either if she doesn't. I figured that." She paused. Pierce Alt told the client the designation was essentially resolved. He turned around then. He had a tag in one hand with a variety name written on it in careful printing. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one he wore when he was working through the implications of something that surprised him less than it should have. "How long has your firm been representing Terra Firm?" he asked. 2 years. He didn't nod. He just let the silence do the work, and she understood, without him saying it, what he was pointing at. She ate lunch at the diner on Harwick's Main Street, which had 4 tables and a counter and served a soup that was different every Thursday and was always worth having. She was halfway through a bowl of white bean and kale when Theo appeared in the doorway, school bag over one shoulder, looking at the menu board with the air of someone pretending to have no particular destination. He sat down at the counter when she waved him over. He ordered hot chocolate and did not pretend to study the menu further. "What are you planting?" she asked. "In the garden. I saw the stakes." He turned to look at her with the measured appraisal she was getting used to. "Garlic," he said. "He says you plant it in fall, and it does most of its work underground all winter, and you don't see it until spring. He says that's actually when the important part is happening." She thought about that. "He says a lot of things," Theo said. "Not a complaint. The kind of observation a person makes when they've found the statement to be consistently true." She watched him drink his hot chocolate. He was careful with it, not fussy, just precise. He set it down in the same spot each time. "Does he always do the work himself?" she asked. "On the house." Theo considered this with seriousness. "He says a building tells you what it needs if you don't talk over it," he said. "He says most people are too busy explaining to it what they want." He finished his hot chocolate. He put on his bag. He said, "See you," in the tone of someone who had already decided that was a reasonable assumption, and walked out. She sat at the counter for several minutes after he left, her hands around the bowl of soup, the diner quiet around her. The message came on a Wednesday. Terra Firm's development director, not Pierce Alt this time, a man she had not dealt with before, called to say that the firm had decided to move forward on the acquisition timeline. and that the historical designation question had been referred to their in-house legal team and would no longer require her involvement. She asked what that meant. He said it meant the situation had been reassessed at the principal level, and they were confident the path forward had been identified. She asked him to be specific about what path. He was not specific. After the call, she sat at her desk for 20 minutes. Then she pulled the TerraFirm file and looked at the contract structure, the indemnification clauses, the representation she and Gwen had signed regarding the viability of the acquisition. She read the relevant sections with the methodical attention she brought to things she needed to understand completely. What she found was that the indemnification language was structured to transfer liability for any unresolved designation issues to the seller's estate, specifically to the executors of Margaret Voss's estate, specifically to the family member serving as executor. She had not written that language. It had been in TerraFirm's standard contract template. She had reviewed it and not flagged it because she had not yet known what she now knew about the designation. Lyndon Voss was the estate executor. She closed the file. She looked out her office window at the parking structure across the street for a long moment. Then she got in her car and drove to Harwick for the third time. He was at the carriage house again, but inside this time, running new electrical conduit along the south wall. The work was careful, the kind of careful that came from understanding not just what the code required, but what the building wanted, how the old structure had been put together, and what it would and wouldn't tolerate from the new material being asked to inhabit it. She told him about the call. She told him about the indemnification clause. She set her copy of the relevant contract section on his workbench and stepped back. He read it once. He set it down and picked up his conduit bender and bent a piece of conduit into the correct angle and fitted it against the wall. He marked the bracket points with a pencil. He did all of this before he spoke. Pierce Alt joined TerraFirm's board of advisors in January, he said, 14 months before they began assembling the Aldrin block. She looked at him. The carriage house and the eastern parcel were the last pieces. They've been working backward from them. The designation wasn't an oversight they discovered. It was a constraint they planned around, assuming they could manage it before closing. How do you know when he joined the board? He set down the conduit bender and looked at her directly. I did restoration work for 12 years in Boston. Before I came back here, there was a project in 2019, a warehouse conversion in the South End. The development group on that project structured the acquisition in a similar way. Liability transferred at closing to a party that had limited resources to contest it. He paused. I was the architect of record on the original structure. I didn't understand what was happening until after closing. The building was demolished 8 weeks later. She was quiet. I understand how those structures work now, he said. I read documents the way other people check the weather. He turned back to the wall and marked another bracket point. Outside, a car passed on the road. Inside, the carriage house smelled like cut wood and old stone, and something that had been built to last, and was being maintained accordingly. My mother's estate would be liable for the designation failure, he said, which means Theo's inheritance would carry the debt. It was the first time he had said his son's name to her, and the way he said it was not weighted with drama. It was simply the specific thing that mattered most, stated as such. Gwen called at 7 that evening. Nadia was still in Harwick, sitting in her car outside the diner, eating a sandwich she'd bought before it closed. Pierce Alt called me, Gwen said. He wants to know if you have a conflict of interest on this file. That's an interesting question for him to ask. Gwen was quiet for a moment. Nadia. He structured the acquisition to transfer liability to a third party without disclosing the designation risk to that party, she said. That's the conflict of interest. We represent the buyer. We represented that the acquisition was viable, she said. It isn't viable the way they've structured it. If we close on this, we've signed our name to something that will end up in front of a disciplinary board. Gwen didn't say anything for a moment. Do you have documentation? I have the enabling legislation, the 2018 commission minutes, the email exchange Pierce's team used to fabricate a state agreement that doesn't exist, and the contract language that transfers the liability. She paused. Yes, I have documentation. The line was quiet. A truck went past on the main street and the sound faded. Send it to me tonight, Gwen said. All of it. She said she would. She hung up. She looked at the dark shape of the carriage house, through the trees at the edge of town, the single light on in the workshop, and she thought about a man who had watched a building come down, because he hadn't understood the paperwork in time and had spent the years since making sure he understood every word. She ate the rest of her sandwich. She sent Gwen the files. Then she got out of her car and walked to the carriage house. He was cleaning his tools when she came in, the methodical end-of-day kind of cleaning that was its own form of accounting for what had been done. He looked up but didn't stop. "Gwen's reviewing it tonight," she said. He nodded. "If the documentation holds, and it does, Pierce Alt misrepresented material information to the client, to us, and to the state office. Terra Firm's deal is dead." He hung a level on its hook. "What happens to your firm? If we caught it before closing, we're fine." She paused. "If we hadn't caught it, we would have had a problem." He looked at her. "Would you have caught it?" "Not before I came here," she said. "No." He considered that without making her explain it further, which was something she had started to notice he did. He didn't require elaboration when the shape of the thing was already clear. It was a form of respect she hadn't expected. She looked around the carriage house. The new framing on the south wall was clean and correct and precise. The conduit ran along the wall with the logic of something that had always been there. "What are you building it into?" she asked. "A workshop," he said. "Maybe a studio. Theo wants a darkroom. He's been reading about film photography. How old is he?" 10. He picked up a broom and began to sweep the sawdust toward the door. "He'll be 11 in March. He reads the manual for every piece of equipment before he touches it." He paused. "I don't know where he gets that." She almost smiled. He swept the sawdust out into the November cold. She stood in the warm interior of the carriage house and looked at the work he'd done and thought about a man who had rebuilt things after losing his, slowly and correctly, without announcing any of it. The deal collapsed on a Tuesday. Gwen presented the documentation to Terra Firm's CEO in a meeting Nadia did not attend but was briefed on in full afterward. Pierce Alt was asked to resign from the advisory board. The email exchange with the state office was referred to the Maine Attorney General's Business Practice Division. Terra Firm's CEO, to his credit, did not attempt to save the acquisition by reframing it. He pulled out cleanly, which Nadia noted as evidence that not every principal was Pierce Alt. The historical designation remained active. The carriage house remained standing. Nadia drove to Harwick on a Friday evening, not to work. She had cleared the afternoon and had not filled it. She told herself she was checking in with the clerk's office about the final commission records she'd needed for the file. The clerk's office was closed on Friday afternoons. She knew this. She parked on the main street and walked. The town was quiet in the way that small towns in November are quiet, not empty but settled. Everyone inside where it was warm, the outdoor world returning to itself after the season's business. She walked past the hardware store and the post office and the diner, which was open, its windows lit and steamed, and kept walking until she reached the edge of the property. Lyndon was at the fence, not working, just standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking out at the field that ran east from the house. The last of the afternoon light going golden across it, the birch trees at the far edge standing white against the dark of the woods beyond. He heard her footsteps on the gravel and turned. He didn't say anything. He turned back to the field. She stopped beside him at the fence. They stood there for a while. The light moved the way light does in November, quickly at first and then slower, as if it can't quite decide to leave. "My mother's doing better," he said. "She's been walking to the end of the drive." "That's new. That's good. She asked about you." He said it without emphasis, just information. "Agnes at the clerk's office mentioned you'd been in twice. Small town, very." A bird crossed the field, low and fast, and disappeared into the birch trees. "What will you do with the carriage house?" she asked. "Finish it," he said. "Take most of the winter, probably. And then?" He was quiet for a moment. "I had a conversation with a firm in Portland last month. Historic Preservation Consulting. They've been looking for someone who understands both the architectural and legal dimensions." He paused. "It's a different version of what I did before." She looked at him. "Why didn't you say something?" "When we were dealing with the designation, you didn't need my resume," he said. "You needed the facts." She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the folder on the workbench and the highlighted paragraph, and the way he had handed it to her without ceremony, as though it were simply the thing that the situation required. You could have used it differently, she said. What you knew, you could have come to Portland, could have made it very uncomfortable for Terra Firm. Theo doesn't need a father who makes things uncomfortable, he said. He needs one who makes things correctly. The light was very low now. The field was going to shadow, the birch trees catching the last of it. From inside the house came the sound of something, a door, then footsteps on the porch. Theo appeared at the corner of the house, with a book under his arm and 2 mugs in his hands, held with the careful stability of someone transporting something valuable. He came down the porch steps and across the yard, unhurried, and when he reached the fence he looked at both of them with the specific assessment of someone who has been thinking about a situation for some time and has arrived at a conclusion. He held out 1 mug to Nadia. She took it. It was tea, something with cinnamon. Theo handed the other to his father, then leaned against the fence post and opened his book with the ease of someone settling in for a while. Nobody explained anything. Nobody needed to. The consulting firm offered Lyndon a position in January. He took it. The work was mostly remote, with site visits, the kind of arrangement that required judgment and expertise more than presence in any particular building, which suited him. He drove Theo to school. He finished the carriage house on the 3rd weekend of February, the last thing being the door that he had built from reclaimed wood that had been in the structure originally, the wood dark, with age and dense in the way of old growth, the kind of material that didn't need treatment because it had already become what it was going to be. He hung it on a cold morning and stood back and looked at it for a long time. Nadia came that Saturday. She had started coming on Saturdays, not everyone, but enough that Theo had stopped noting her arrival as an event and had started incorporating it into the general order of things, the way you incorporate weather, or a good neighbor, something reliable that you stop consciously expecting because it has become part of the assumption. He showed her the door. She ran her hand along the surface. The grain was tight and varied, the color uneven in the way of honest material. "How old is this wood?" she asked. "The tree it came from was probably standing when this town was platted," he said. 1847. She kept her hand on it. "You didn't replace it. It didn't need replacing. It needed to be used correctly." She looked at him then. He was looking at the door, at the hinge work, checking the gap at the bottom, the way you check something you made yourself because you know where you cut the corner and want to confirm you didn't. "I've been talking to Gwen about restructuring my focus," she said. "Preservation cases. The historical designation work has applications I hadn't thought much about before." She paused. "It turns out there's a lot of buildings that need someone who reads the paperwork." He looked at her. He had an expression she had seen before, the one that meant he had followed the sentence to where it was going, and was deciding whether to say so. "That's a different version of what you did before," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood at the door of the carriage house in the February cold, the sky, flat and white. The birch trees, edged with ice at the tips, and neither of them said the thing that was already understood, because it had been understood for some time, the way some structures support weight long before anyone tests them. Spring came, the garlic came up in April, exactly where the stakes had been, exactly as Theo had said it would. He walked Nadia through the row on a morning that smelled like cold earth and new growth, pointing out each variety with the precision of someone who had planted something in fall and was now accounting for it. Lyndon watched from the porch with his coffee. His mother, Margaret, came out of the house behind him and stood beside him at the railing, both of them looking at the garden. She had been walking to the end of the drive for 2 months now. Last week she had walked to the corner. "She's good with him," Margaret said. "She's good with most things," he said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She had the specific patience of someone who has lived long enough to know that most important things don't require commentary. "The carriage house looks right," she said. "It took a while. The ones that take a while usually do." She went inside. He stayed on the porch with his coffee. In the garden, Theo was explaining something about soil temperature, and Nadia was listening with her arms folded and her head tilted, the posture of someone who had stopped performing attention and was simply paying it. He watched her for a while, the easy way she had settled into this morning, into this town, into the specific orbit of this house and this child and this unremarkable Saturday in April. He had not been looking for any of this. He wasn't sure she had been either. He thought that might be the only reason it had arrived the way it did. quietly, through the side door, without announcement, the way the most lasting things tend to come. When you have finally stopped making room for something else, and simply left the space open. The garlic stood straight in the April light. The birch trees at the field's edge were beginning to leaf, small and pale and certain. Theo pointed at something in the soil, and Nadia crouched down to look at it. And she said something that made him laugh, a real laugh, the unself-conscious kind. Lyndon drank his coffee. The morning was cold and clean and very still, and there was nowhere else any of them were supposed to be.